Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Splash of Color Block B webinar. I am Sarah Vedla, and if you haven't met me before, I was born and raised in England, hence a funny accent. I now live in Scottsdale, Arizona with my two daughters and my two dogs. I'm hoping that the two dogs are going to be quiet for me whilst we're talking today. I'll apologize now if the one that's in the room with me starts barking. I have been sewing forever. Learned to sew on my mum's 1964 Bernina record when I was about 6. Just loved sewing, did all kinds of home dec, making clothes, making dolls' clothes. Took my sewing machine to university with me, ended up with a PhD in computer science from the University of Brighton in England, and moved on to my professional life as a software engineer and project manager. And I came over here to the United States January 10th, 1998, where I continued working as a software engineer and project manager. When my eldest daughter, Heather, was born, I became a stay-at-home mom. And just before her first birthday, I discovered quilts and embroidery machines and fell in love and decided this is what I need to be doing. Just loved all the creativity that I was seeing. And I seriously fell in love. So I have been creating beauty, inspiration, and infinite creative joy as a quilt designer ever since 2009. Now, the Splash of Color quilt was created as a 6-part series quilt for McCall's Quilting magazine. So there's going to be one part in each issue of 2016. Parts 1 through 5 are the applique blocks, and that should say part 6 is putting it all together. There's optional machine embroidered applique that you can do, and there's 2 versions of it which come in the download. One of them is the basic, and that is a simple, very elegant, I might say, satin stitch finish with my signature triple stitch on the inside and the outside edges of the satin stitch. And that allows you to really focus on the fabric. Now, that's the version that I used on the quilt that you see on the top right-hand corner here. That is, and that's the version that's actually published in the magazine. So you really focus on the fabric. And the fabric that I used is my Transformations fabric, some really bold, bright, geometric prints. So focus really on the fabric. The other version is the embroidered, and this allows you to focus more on the thread. So using a solid colored background, you really see the beautiful thread work. And I decided, actually, I think it was back in November, that I really wanted to make this quilt again using the embroidered version of the designs. And so I'm about a couple of weeks ahead of you guys in terms of doing my stitching. So part 1 had block A, and that was in the January-February edition of the magazine. You were creating an 8.5-inch square with a 1 3/4-inch border, creating a 12-inch square block. Pretty much all of the blocks in the quilt are 12 inches square. So on the top here, you see the basic version, which is allowing you to showcase the fabric, and then on the bottom you see the embroidered version, and that really allows you, if you use that on solid color fabric, that really allows you to showcase some beautiful thread work in the stitching. On a lot of machines, you can do this in a single hooping. If you have a hoop that's 7 3/4 inches square, that's 197 millimeters. So the Bernina Jumbo hoop is the one that I used, and that is one hooping. There are also instructions and designs to allow you to accomplish that in smaller hoops. So if you have, say, a Bernina large oval hoop, then you can do it in 2 hoopings. And if you have a 5 by 7-inch hoop, then you're going to need to do that in 3 hoopings. I am just loving the photographs that you guys are posting on Facebook of your completed blocks, and I've got some of them here. Just love the different color combinations, and you can see here on the top there are a couple of blocks here where people have chosen not to put the applique fabric down and really showcasing the thread work on the background. Beautiful option. Lots of them lots of different color variations. I just love to see the different colors that people put together, and you're really making this unique. And that's the best part of what I do, is seeing what you do with the designs, how you put your personal stamp on them. Just love it. And so you can see we've got some brights and we've got some more subtle colors. The lady who posted the block on the top middle here said that's not a black and white photograph, that is a black and gray quilt, and it looks super elegant. Can't wait to see that when it's finished. Also love this gray and blue one down on the bottom right hand corner. That one reminds me of snowflakes for some reason. Just had to give you a photograph of this one, just in case you haven't seen it on the Facebook page. Somebody who has gone overboard, and you have well and truly finished with block A and block B, and has put these designs together for the center of the quilt and made it into a small quilt. I just love that. Love the bright colors going along on the outside. I also love the fact that she said for the center block and for the four corners squares, she used designs from my Transformation quilting collection to do the quilting. Hope you can see that in detail on the screen there. It really does set the quilt off, and it looks beautiful. So here we are with block 2, or part 2, and block B, and this is available in the March-April edition of the magazine. You will need to purchase the magazine for the majority of the instructions, but everything pertinent to the embroidered applique you'll find in the download for that design. So part B, or block B, finishes as a 12-inch square block. Again, you've got the two versions, the basic one showing on the top right-hand corner, and that's showcasing the fabric. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, you've got the embroidered version, which is showcasing the thread. So you would use a solid fabric on there. Now, unless you have one of the super hoops on one of the multi-needle machines, you're going to need to do this in 2 hoopings, even if you have the Bernina jumbo hoop. Actually, if you're working on a Bernina, the first hooping with the 2 hoopings will fit into the mega hoop, and the second one will actually fit into the maxi hoop. So it's even not full jumbo hoop size, but you will need to do this in 2 hoopings, or even more. 3 hoopings if you have a mega hoop, 4 hoopings if you have a large oval hoop, and 7 hoopings if you have just a 5x7. Actually, if you're trying to do this project with a 5x7 hoop, could you leave me a shout out in the comments? I'm curious to know how many people are actually going that route. Give me some good information to make sure that I'm covering everything for you. So, in the interests of a bunch of you have already watched the Block A webinar, and some of you are new, I'm trying to accommodate both of you. So for the people who have already seen this information, I'll try and go fairly fast. And for the people who are new to this, I want to give you enough detail that's going to get you started. If you want some really in-depth, then I would recommend that you watch the Block A webinar, which is available on a DVD. So the steps to success in embroidered applique. First of all, you're going to assemble your supplies. Then you're going to prepare your applique shapes, and I like to do that up front so that when I start to stitch, I've got everything all ready and cut out. Then you're going to prepare your background fabric, and last but not least, you're going to stitch the design. Now for your supplies, I'm going to try and do this fairly fast. Obviously, you've got your fabric. The Transformation fabric is what you'll see in the quilt that's published in the magazine. And there is a kit available for that. The version that I'm doing with the solid fabrics, I'm using Michael Miller Cotton Couture. I just love the colors that are available, dozens of colors. I don't actually know quite how many, but dozens of different colors available in that line. Beautiful, soft, solid cotton fabric. Having said that, you can use pretty much any fabric that you want. Thread, my favorite is the Arfil Cotton Mako 50 weight. The Transformation Warm and Transformation Cool thread kits go with the transformation fabric. Bobbin thread, I always put superior bottom line tan in the bobbin. No need to change that every time you change the thread on the top. The tan works beautifully with just about any color you can put in the top. The only time I would change would be white thread on white background, in which case I'd put white in the bobbin. Needles, I'm sticking with my superior titanium top stitch needle, size 80-12. Those work beautifully with the Aurifil Cotton Maco 50 weight, and they're also going to work just beautifully with the polyester threads, for instance, the Isacord and the Floriani, I know a lot of people use. Always like to have a tub of pins, and my new favorite, Scotch Magic Tape, is coming in way useful in my sewing studio. Got a couple of different applications for that I'll show you in a few minutes. A small iron, my two top favorites are the Top Flight Sealing Iron and the newly discovered Clover Wedge Iron. Both of them have a really nice solid plate on them, and they fit beautifully into the small hoops. They give you, both of them have a really good point on them, so you can get really precise and make sure that you get into all of the corners. And they both also get really nice and hot, which is key for making sure that your applique shapes are fused in place. Fusible webbing. You're going to use this to fuse your applique shapes to your background. I have two that I like to use. The Heat and Bond Light, if I'm cutting my applique shapes using one of the electronic cutting machines. The Heat and Bond Light gives me the best results there. Alternatively, I love to use Shades Soft Fuse. And if I'm using the AccuQuilt Go Cutter, or heaven forbid, if I'm cutting out applique shapes by hand, then I would choose the Shades Soft Fuse. Super nice, really lightweight adhesive, doesn't show through at all, keeps your colors really nice and clear. Stabilizer is what's going to support the embroidery. I pretty much always go with a medium weight and a tearaway, and my favorite to use is the OESD Ultra Clean and Tear. Gives me great results, and I pretty much always use 2 layers of it in the hoop, and again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Interfacing, and you're going to use that if your fabric needs some extra support. Now, what I've discovered with the Michael Miller Cotton Couture solid fabric, it is so fine that sometimes, especially with the lighter colors, so for instance, in this project, we're using yellow, sometimes the background fabric will show through. So I will put interfacing on the back of my applique fabric and then apply the fusible webbing, and that will help to keep the colors nice and clean and clear, and you're not going to see any show through from the background fabric. My favorite to use is Pellon Shape Flex. This is a woven, it's actually 100% cotton woven, and it's also fusible. Spray starch is optional. Again, using the Michael Miller Cotton Couture, I started doing a gentle spritz of the Mary Ellen's Best Press on it, just to give it a little bit more stiffness, because it is so, the fabric by itself is so very drapey. So I gave it a little spritz of the Mary Ellen's Best Press and got myself a really nice firm background to work on. Okay, step 2, prepare your applique shapes. Now, the thing that I really wanted to talk to you about here that's specific to Block B is how to cut your applique shapes when you have a stripe involved. Now, this isn't going to apply for using a solid fabric, but if you're using the transformation fabric that comes in the kit, then some of the applique shapes are, some of the applique fabrics have a stripe in them. So I wanted to just give you a heads up on how to make sure that stripe is going in the direction that you want it in. First of all, if you're using the SVG files and an electronic cutting machine to cut your shapes, you have absolutely nothing to worry about, because the shapes are being put into the SVG files so that as long as you align the stripe with your cutting mat, the stripe in the applique shape is going to be going in the right direction. Now, I wanted to point out here, this is applicable to SVG usage with the Silhouette Studio software and the Cameo cutting machine. I've had people email me and let me know that when you open up the some of the SVG cutting files, you see a black blob and no shapes. And what you're supposed to be seeing is a nice color coordinated thing that shows you if there are different shapes, then they should be showing up in different colors so that you can select the shapes that you want, and it's easy to eliminate the shapes that you don't want. So I've been playing around with this quite a bunch. I have 3 different computers, each with a different version of the software on it. And I also had a conversation with Kendall at Silhouette. So if you have version 3.4, point anything, 3.4, you're going to, when you open up an SVG file, everything will be converted into black. And the black shape, actually everything will be filled with a black solid. So if you have 3.4, you're more than likely going to run into problems. They have fixed the problem, and if you go to the Silhouette download page and look in the beta version of the download, you'll find version 3.7.150. Now that's not in the full downloads page. I think if you go down a little bit, you'll find the beta version, and 3.7.150, the problem with the SVG files going black has been fixed. So hopefully that will help a lot of you that have been coming up with this problem. If you are using the AccuQuilt Go Cutter and the Heather Feather border die, this is where it actually turns out to be really easy to make sure that your stripes are going in the right direction. Now, in the download for Block B, you're going to find a PDF file called diecuttingstripes.pdf. And if you print it out, it'll actually print out full size on 3 different sheets. Now, in the instructions, it says make sure you print this out at 100%. It actually doesn't matter if it's not exactly at 100%, because all you want is the angles. The scale of it doesn't matter too much. So what you'll see for each of the shapes that require a stripe to go in a specific direction, I've put a rectangle around the shape and there's the pink arrow there. So what you're going to do is cut along the side of the shape, or along the side of the rectangle, or if you wanted to make it easy, just cut along the pink arrow, and you're going to lay this the relevant section of the printout so that the top edge is aligned with the top edge of your board. And you can see here that I've got a piece of the pink stripy fabric laying right along the cut edge of the paper. Now, I'm going to flip back to this screen again. So I'm cutting out shape number 7. So you can see I've got that rectangle around shape number 7, and then you've got the pink arrow indicating the direction of the stripe. So what I did was I printed out the template. I cut along the right-hand side, the long right-hand side of the rectangle around shape number 7. I also trimmed off the edge of the paper, and then I placed the paper onto the die cutting board, and that allowed me to align my piece of stripy fabric along with that angled edge. And you can see here that I actually held it in place with some Scotch tape to prevent the fabric from shifting as I'm pushing the die through the machine, through the Go Cutter. And here's a slightly bigger version of it. You can see here the very edge of the rectangle. So I've got the paper lined up with the die board, and I've got my fabric lined up with the cut edge of the paper. And that allows me to create a shape my applique shape that has the fabric going in exactly the direction that I want it to. So if you do that for all of the stripy fabrics, if you're using the Go Cutter, then you'll see on the block, specifically using the teal fabric, you'll have the stripe all going in the right direction. I think that'll add a nice bit of class to your block there. Okay, step 3, preparing the background fabric. Now for block A, we had an 8.5 inch square, so you were cutting a 10-inch square of fabric for your background, and the marking instructions were super simple. Draw a cross or a plus sign on your piece of stabilizer to mark the center of the block. So you can see how I've marked the stabilizer on the left-hand side of the picture, basted along that stitching line, and then so that when you flip the block over, you've got the bobbin thread showing up on the right side of your fabric. Now for block B, I'll go into a little bit more detail here. Preparing your background fabric, you're first of all going to cut your piece of background fabric. Now, this is kind of a embroidered applique rule of thumb. If you have a 12-inch finished square block, which we do for this particular block, I'm going to add an inch all around. So I'm going to actually cut a 14-inch square. So 12 inches plus an inch on either side is going to give me a 14-inch square. And we'll be trimming that down to 12.5 inches so that you can piece it into the rest of the quilt. But I want a little bit of extra because I know that the embroidery is always going to shrink up the design a little bit, unless you make the background fabric so stiff, it's not going to shrink as much. But I prefer to keep my fabric nice and supple and allow myself a little bit of fudge factor. So for a 12-inch finished square, I'm going to cut my background fabric at 14 inches. Then I'm going to cut a piece of stabilizer. Now for a 12-inch finished square, knowing that all of the embroidery is going to be within that 12 inches, I can happily cut a 12-inch piece of stabilizer and know that all of my stitching is going to be right on top of the stabilizer. I'm not going to risk running off into an unstabilized piece because of the markings that I'm going to draw on the stabilizer. So for a 12-inch finished square, or 12-inch finished block, I'm going to cut a 12-inch square of stabilizer. I'm then going to mark the stabilizer as specified in the instructions. For block A, it was pretty easy. You just did that big plus sign in the center. For block B, because there are, let's see, 4 different splits to accommodate the different hoop sizes, there are actually different instructions for marking your stabilizer depending on which version of the designs you're going to use. And I'll be looking at all 4 of those. Then you're going to baste the stabilizer to the wrong side of your background fabric. So if you put your background fabric down on the table or the cutting mat and place the marked stabilizer right side up in the center of your background fabric, you'll be in good shape. And you're going to baste along all of the lines that you've drawn for your marking. So let's have a little look in a little bit more detail at the marking. Now, if you're going to do this block in 1 hooping, and the design for that is block B, if you have the Bernina E16, or I suspect some of the other multi-needle machines have a 12 by 12 hoop or even bigger, you can do this all in 1 hooping. All you need to do is draw the vertical, which is showing up in the blue line on the left-hand side here, and you need to draw the center horizontal line, which I'm showing it in pink. And I always recommend that you label the top and bottom of your piece of stabilizer, just so you make sure everything is the right way up. So A is going to be at the top, B I've put over on the left-hand side, C at the bottom, D on the right-hand side. Now, bearing in mind, when you're looking at the stabilizer and you're drawing onto the stabilizer, what you're actually seeing is a mirror of what you will see when you have basted it to the back of the fabric and flipped it over and you're looking at it from the from the top side or the right side of the fabric. So when you're looking at this from the right side of the fabric, you're still going to have A at the top, C at the bottom, but you're going to have B on the right hand side and D on the left hand side. If you need to do this in 2 or 3 hoopings, so you're either going to be using the designs labeled split 1 for 2 hoopings or the designs labeled split 2 for 3 hoopings, then you will mark as specified in the center picture here. So split 1, the first hooping is going to be the mega hoop, and the second hooping is going to be the maxi hoop. If you don't have a maxi hoop and you're working on a banina, but you do have a jumbo hoop, that's going to be just fine. But you can't fit the whole thing into one jumbo hooping. It's not big enough. So for 2 or 3 hoopings, using the split 1 or split 2 version of the designs, you're going to draw the blue vertical line in the center of your stabilizer. You're going to draw the red or the pink horizontal line in the center of your stabilizer. And then you're going to draw the green line 1 inch below the pink center line. So 1 inch below. And you can see where I've labeled 1. So the intersection between the blue line and the green line in the center there, that is the intersection that you're going to use. Now, the reason I'm not using the center of the whole block, so the intersection between the blue and the pink lines, is because that intersection is perilously close to being underneath an applique shape. So it's great for getting the first hooping all lined up correctly, but you lose your center when you're trying to get the second hooping lined up. So that's why I shifted the center down just a little bit there, actually by 1 inch. Now, if you have a Banina large oval hoop or equivalent and you need to do this in 4 hoopings, then you're going to use the split 3 designs, and you're going to mark it as shown on the right-hand side here. So you're still going to start out with your vertical center and your horizontal center shown with the blue and the pink lines. Then you're going to add the green line 3 inches above the center, the horizontal center, and you're going to add the orange lines, and those are going to be 3 inches on both sides of the blue vertical center line. Now, anytime you're drawing your lines, I'm going to reiterate this, when you draw your first line, absolutely measure in from the side of your stabilizer. Once you've drawn your first line, all of your future lines, so second and subsequent lines, you need to mark using the first line that you drew as your reference point. So in just the same way, if you're using your rotary cutter to cut out some squares, you're going to cut your first, maybe you'll trim the edge off your piece of fabric, and then in order to do the next cut, you're going to use the lines on your ruler against that brand new cut in order to make the second cut. So I want you to do that same technique for drawing the lines. Instead of cutting with a rotary cutter, you're going to be drawing with a pencil or a pen here. But all lines after the first line that you've drawn should be based using one of the existing lines as the reference point. And you want to make sure that your lines are truly perpendicular, otherwise you'll end up with some potentially strange results. So again here for block B, if you're using the block B design, stitching the whole thing out all in one, for instance, if you have the Banina E16 and that super jumbo square hoop, then you're going to do your blue vertical line and your pink horizontal line both in the center. If you're going to do split 1 or split 2, then you're going to have that same vertical center, horizontal center, and you're going to add the green line 1 inch below the horizontal center. And if you're using split 3, which has the 4 hoopings, then you're always going to start out with your blue vertical in the center, your pink horizontal in the center. You're going to have the green line 3 inches above the pink center line, and you're going to have the orange lines 3 inches on either side of the blue vertical. Okay, now we get to the really good bit, and that's the stitching of the design. So you've got your background fabric and you've got all of your applique shapes cut out. I actually cut these out on the silhouette, nice and clean cuts going on here. First of all, I've marked my stabilizer. Before I go any further, I'm actually going to make sure that that is basted onto the background fabric, so on the wrong side of the background fabric, and I use a 4mm long stitch length to do that basting. You can see I've stitched the vertical center line and I've stitched what would have been the green center line, so it's actually the line that's 1 inch below the center line. You can see I've marked that with an X on the left hand side there. I'm using a 4mm long stitch length, going to give me a nice sturdy seam or stitching line, and it's also super simple to clip every 3 or 4 threads and pull those threads out when you want to get rid of them. The beautiful thing about this method of marking the stabilizer and then basting it onto your background fabric is I have the back of the fabric marked with the lines that I've drawn on the stabilizer, and I've also got the front of the fabric marked with the stitching line. So gives me, it makes it super easy to align my background fabric in the hoop so that I can get the design exactly where I want it. I took this photograph when I was preparing for the webinar, and I sat there looking at it afterwards thinking, why in the world did I take this? And then it occurred to me that I wanted to remember to tell you, if you have the option on your sewing machine for using a dual feed foot, when you're stitching the stabilizer onto your background fabric, go ahead and use it. I am stitching here on my Bernina 8 series machine. This, the one I have set up for sewing is one of the 830s, and I'm using the 34D foot. It's the clear plastic foot, and you can see it's got that red line in the center between the toes. So that red line allows me to stitch exactly on top of the line that I've drawn on the stabilizer, and this piece at the back here, this black piece, and then there's this silver piece, metal piece that's hooking into the back of the foot. That's the dual feed part of the foot, and it basically feeds the top and the bottom through at the same rate. So it's going to give you a really nice seam, and I actually use this for all of my piecing now. It's not quite the same as a walking foot, but it's almost the same as a walking foot, and it's going to give you some really great results and some really really sturdy seams. So if you have that option available, be sure to use it. Going to love it, I think. Okay, so stitching the design. The first thing you want to do is put a piece of stabilizer into your hoop. And when I was in Florida in December, I showed this, or I didn't actually have any double-sided tape with me, but I told people about a method that I've been using to make sure that the stabilizer is seated in the hoop really well, and everybody loved it, so I wanted to be sure to tell you guys about it today. So I have started using, especially on the long hoop, so this is the maxi hoop. I'd also use it on the sides of my mega hoop and definitely on my big jumbo hoop. I've taken to putting double-sided Scotch tape on the underneath of the inner hoop so that the hoop is actually sticking to the stabilizer. Makes it so easy to get the stabilizer into the hoop so that it's nice and taut, and just it just works so well. So what you're going to do is take a piece of tape, put it on both sides, both of the long sides, and then you can also put a little bit on the top and bottom of the hoop as well. Now I know on my hoops, on the Bernina hoops, you have a ridge, basically. You have kind of a dip in the middle, but as long as the tape is wide enough to cover the two sides, you can pretty much ignore that little ridge. So you're going to put tape on all 4 sides of your hoop, and then you're going to turn the hoop over and place it right onto your stabilizer, so that the inner hoop is right in the middle of your piece of stabilizer, and press it down on all of the pieces of tape. And so that's making sure that your piece of stabilizer is nice and taut across the bottom of your hoop. So now when you lift that inner hoop up, your piece of stabilizer is going to come with it automatically because it's stuck to it. So you're going to put the top end of the hoop in first, and that's a pretty easy slide. So you're just going to use your hand to make sure that the top end of the hoop is nicely seated, and then you're going to use the heel of your hand to push the bottom of the hoop in. Now, here's something else I want to tell you about when I do my hooping. When I unhoop, I release the hoop or I release the outer hoop only enough to allow the inner hoop to be pushed out. I don't want it opened up so that the inner hoop falls out. And the reason for that is when I want to add the next piece of stabilizer, I want the outside hoop to be nice and snug so that by the time I got my inner hoop in it with a stabilizer, I really don't have to tighten it up a whole lot at all. And that will ensure that my stabilizer is nice and tight. So try that out and let me know what you think. Another thing that I wanted to make sure about is when you've put the hoop in, this picture here is actually the bottom of the hoop. So I want to make sure that the inner hoop is pushed all the way through the outer hoop, so that if you were to rub your finger over the join line between the inside of the hoop and the outside of the hoop, you'll feel you'll actually feel the stabilizer. So if you were rubbing your finger from the bottom left-hand corner of this picture here, you'd start out on the plastic of the hoop, and your finger would actually raise up as it goes onto the stabilizer. If you have, if the inner hoop isn't pushed all the way through, then you're at risk of the inner hoop falling out of the outside hoop, and I've actually seen that happen in a class. And once you've got 45 minutes of stitching in there for your hoop to fall apart is quite devastating. So you want to make sure that the hoop is pushed all the way into the hoop, and doing that will also prevent scratching on the throat plate of your machine. What colored thread do you use to stitch your placement lines? That is something that people email me about quite frequently, and the answer typically is, as long as you can see it, whatever the thread is that you have on the machine, it really doesn't matter. The key is that you can actually see the placement line. And that is Ruthie, who is barking about the fact that somebody is making a noise outside. Sorry about that. Hold on one second. Okay, so when you see the placement line in the designs for the splash of color, you'll see the placement line is set as black, and the color number is either 0, 1, or 2. The reason that I did that is not because I want you to use black thread. In fact, don't use black thread unless you're stitching onto a black background. But the reason that I put them in there as black is so that you can see clearly on your embroidery machine screen that this is in fact a placement line. So anytime you see black, the color black with a 0, 1, or 3 as the color number, then you can know that that's a placement line, either for showing you where to put the background fabric or showing you where to put the applique shapes. So having stitched the placement line directly onto the stabilizer in the hoop, you'll note that I never, 99% of the time, never ever actually hoop my fabric. I've only got stabilizer in the hoop. The key now with a placement line stitched out onto the stabilizer is, how do I get the center stitched or indicated by the stitching on the background fabric so that it's aligned with the center that's stitched onto the stabilizer or the placement line. And actually all it takes is a pin. So you're going to take a pin and push it through the intersection marked on the background fabric, And then you're going to take that same pin and push it through the intersection that has stitched out onto the stabilizer. Now, I use the June Taylor Cushion Quilters Square and Blocker to do this. The key about this, it's an 18, I think it's an 18-inch by 24-inch padded ironing board, and it does not have a cutting mat on the back side of it. It doesn't have that cutting mat, so it's literally an ironing board. It's got a nice padded surface, but the key is that the board will actually allow you to push a pin into it. So, and if you're not on a tabletop, if you can actually push a pin all the way through. So actually, you want to be careful that you don't scratch your best dining room table if you're doing this there, because the pin will go all the way through. But the key point is that the pin is going to give you a super good pivot point, which will allow you to get your background fabric aligned exactly to 100% onto the stabilizer. So you can see in this picture here, I've got the one pin. You can see the little pink head on the right-hand side. It's through the intersection on the background fabric. I've also guided it through the intersection that has stitched onto the stabilizer, and I've smoothed the background fabric so that it's flush with the stabilizer. Then what I'm going to do is lift up the bottom edge of the fabric, making sure where the pin is that the background fabric is really flush up against the hoop. And I'm going to lift up the bottom edge so that I can see the placement line that's stitched onto the stabilizer in the hoop. And I can also see the basting line, or the line that I drew to mark the intersections on the stabilizer. And using that pin as a pivot, I can move the background fabric around the pin so that I have an exact alignment, as you can see there. Now, I'm also going to do the same at the top of the hoop. Theoretically, if the center is in alignment and the bottom is in alignment, the top should also be in alignment, but I'm always going to check just to make sure. And I'm also going to check on the right-hand side, actually on the left-hand side of this. So I've got 3 different directions that I'm checking to make sure that the background fabric is perfectly aligned with the intersection that has been stitched out onto the stabilizer in the hoop. Now, having done that, I'm going to use my Scotch tape to hold the background fabric onto the stabilizer in the hoop. So you can see here, hopefully, that I've got a good piece of Scotch tape, Scotch magic tape, all the way from one side of the hoop to the other side of the hoop. Now, I've done that at the top and the bottom of the hoop so that the background fabric is securely held in place. Now, before I go back to the machine, I want to do a couple of checks to make sure that the background fabric is aligned correctly. So the first check, I'm going to hold the hoop up to a window or the light source, whatever, if I'm working at nighttime, not that I usually do, but I'm going to hold it up to the light. In this case, I'm holding it up to the window so that I can see through the hoop. And I want to look from the stabilizer side. And you can see here very clearly the placement line that's stitched onto the stabilizer, and you actually can't see the placement line that has been basted onto the background fabric. And the reason you can't see it is because I've got this so well aligned. So the key here is, if you could see the basting line stitched onto the background fabric, then your placement is ever so slightly off. And my recommendation is take the background fabric off the hoop and start again with your pin. It is possible to achieve perfect placement here. The second check that I usually do is I hold the hoop up against the screen, and looking at the screen, I can generally get a good idea of, have I got that piece of background fabric the right way around? Now, for this particular design for block B, in 2 hoopings, the first part is going to be the left-hand side of the block, and the second part is going to be the right-hand side of the block. So knowing that this is going to be stitching the left-hand side of the block, the fact that the left-hand side of the block background fabric is on the hoop and the right-hand side is hanging off the side of the hoop, I know that I'm in good shape for this thing turning out correctly. So now back on the embroidery machine, I'm going to stitch color number 2, which is a basting line that holds the fabric securely onto the hoop, and it's also the applique placement lines. And again, this is going to show up as black, probably color number 1, on your embroidery machine using the designs. The key is use a thread color that you can see clearly. So I'm using pink here, simply because that's what was on the machine since the last time I did some stitching, and also because I can see the applique placement lines super clearly. It makes it really easy to get everything aligned where I want them. Now here, I put this slide in because I wanted you to see that it's possible to get absolute 100% perfect alignment here. So you can see the 2 vertical lines. The one on the right hand side is actually the basting line that's stitched out in color number 2. The vertical line that's about 1/8 of an inch to the left of it, that is the center line that you draw on the stabilizer and then you stitched along with your 4mm stitch length to hold the background fabric and the stabilizer together. And you can see on that line, I've got the paisley shape at the bottom. The corner of it is right on that line, and up at the top there's the other paisley shape. The point is right on the line, and then the I guess the backward question mark shape or the candy cane shape, the edge of that is right on the line. So that's what you're aiming for. You should be able to achieve that 100% perfect placement. Now, I do like to remove the placement lines that trying not to get tangled up in a knot here between, there's the basting line that holds the background fabric onto the stabilizer and the hoop, and then there's the placement line that we stitched to show how to get the stabilizer or the background fabric onto the stabilizer and the hoop. I want to get rid of any of that basting line that's going to be showing up underneath an applique shape. Main reason for that is if I'm using a light colored applique shape and I've used a dark thread, in this case this pink thread, it's entirely possible that that will actually show up underneath either the yellow or the orange applique shapes that I'm going to use here. So I'm going to get rid of that. So you can see the horizontal, I've gotten rid of that, but I want to make sure that I have the center point intersection intact. Want to make sure that that is kind of crucial. So you can see that I've eliminated most of that horizontal stitching line, but I've still got the intersection intact. On the vertical line, you can see that I've ripped out the threads that are right up against the applique shapes. It's much easier to get rid of the threads now rather than when I've got the applique shapes in place and I've got all of the satin stitch finished. Don't want to have little thread ends popping out there. So now I'm going to fuse the applique shapes in place. And again, I've taken the hoop off the machine here, taken it over to my ironing board. I'm using my top flight, and I have a slide here to show you how exactly the applique shapes will fit into the placement line. They will be a perfect fit. So you want to be as precise as you can be when you're positioning your applique shapes, and make sure that the applique shapes aren't shifting around when you do your pressing. This is one of the benefits to having the nice small head on the top flight or the clover wedge iron, is that you can hold on to the applique shapes or one end of the applique shapes whilst you're pressing the other side. If you're trying to do this with one of the bigger regular sized irons, it's really easy for the applique shapes to shift around. So you want to make sure that everything is as precise as you can get it, because the applique shapes will be a perfect fit for the placement line. Then you're going to continue stitching until the design is finished, changing your thread colors as necessary. And using your favorite thread colors on there. You don't have to go with the thread colors that I have been using here. So now that the first hooping is finished, you want to remove everything from the hoop. And you're going to remove the basting line that we stitched out in color number 2 that held the background fabric onto the hoop. And then you're going to tear away the stabilizer that was in the hoop. So you can see on this picture here, you can still see the hoop outline on the stabilizer. That stabilizer all disappears from around the outside of your applique shapes. The stabilizer that is basted to the background fabric stays. So you want to leave the stabilizer that's basted to the background fabric. That stays put until all of the hoopings are complete. In order to get the basting thread out, what I do is clip every 3 or 4 stitches with a pair of sharp pair of scissors or thread snips, and then use my tweezers to just pluck them out. Should be really easy to do. And the stitch length is, it's like that 4 millimeter. I think I actually use a 5 millimeter stitch here so that it's going to hold nicely whilst I want the stitches in, and it's going to pull out really easily when I need the stitches to come out. And that's just a closer up view. I've got every second or third stitch here. I've just clipped them and then using my tweezers to pull the threads out. On the back here, you can see that I've eliminated the majority of the stabilizer that was in the hoop from around the outside of the applique shapes. In between the applique shapes, you can still see it just a little bit, the different shade of white there where you've got the 2 layers of stabilizer still. I prefer just to get rid of the stuff that's really all around the outside, and then I'll go in with my tweezers after I finish stitching everything to remove those bits. But I don't want to have 2 layers. I don't want to have 2 layers of stabilizer on what's showing up as the left-hand side of this screen here, because by the time I'm done stitching, that would end up as 3 layers. So I want to get rid of all of the stuff around the outside of the applique shapes. So now you're ready for your second hooping, and basically you're going to do it exactly the same way that you did the first hooping. The only difference is that there's already an embroidery design that's been stitched out onto your background fabric. That is the only difference. Everything else is going to work exactly the same way. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to ignore the stitching that is already been stitched onto your background fabric. Pretend that you're starting out with a brand new piece of background fabric, and you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to get the exact same level of precision, and by the time you're done, your designs are going to intersect beautifully. So a new piece of stabilizer into the hoop, and you're going to stitch color number 1, and that's going to be a placement line again to show you how to position the background fabric onto the hoop. And you can see here I've got a paler pink thread here, so literally to stitch this placement line on the stabilizer in the hoop, I'm using whatever thread I had on the machine for the last thing I stitched. So now my goal is to align the intersection with my vertical and horizontal over here on the right hand side. I'm going to align that intersection with the intersection that is stitched out onto the stabilizer in the hoop. I'm going to use my seine pin, so put the pin through the background fabric right through that intersection and guide that same pin through the intersection that's stitching that's stitched out on the stabilizer in the hoop. Whoa, that was the wrong button. Here we go. I've got the 1 pin in, and again I'm doing this on my June Taylor cushion quilted square and blocker. And now I want to make absolutely sure that the fabric is flush with a stabilizer in the hoop. One thing to note about the fact that you have got some stitching on here, that might give you a couple of little wrinkles, so make sure that everything is smoothed nicely. The background fabric is smoothed nicely onto the stabilizer in the hoop. And again, you're going to do your flip up the bottom edge and flip up the top edge, make sure that everything is aligned. This time around, I would also flip up the right-hand side edge, and I've used Scotch tape on the top and the bottom of the hoop where I can see stabilizer. I used an extra pin on the right-hand side to accommodate the weight of the stitching, just to make sure that stuff wasn't shifting around. And you can also see on the left-hand side, just to the right of the candy cane shape, that I've got another pin in there. And again, that is to accommodate the weight of the stitching that's already on the background fabric. Again, I want to make sure that I've done my double check. So I'm going to hold this up to a light source. Here I'm holding it up to the window. And I want to make sure that the placement line that's stitched out onto the stabilizer is perfectly aligned with the placement line that's stitched out onto the background fabric. And you can see that that is beautifully in position there. And then I'm also going to make sure by holding the hoop up to the embroidery machine that what's going to stitch out looks like it's going to stitch in the right place. So then I'm going to put the machine, or put the hoop back onto the machine and stitch out color number 2. That's going to give me a basting line, and it's going to follow straight on with the applique placement lines. And you can see here how perfectly aligned that is. And you too can achieve that. Might take a little bit of practice, a couple of times to try, but by the time you've done all 4 blocks, your 4th block is going to be just incredibly perfectly aligned. Here I've removed all of the placement lines from the background fabric. I want to make sure that I don't have those showing through underneath any of the applique shapes. So my trusted little Havells double curved scissors and my Bernina tweezers make easy work of pulling those threads out. I'm going to fuse my applique shapes in place and then back onto the machine and continue stitching until everything is done. Wanted to show you a couple of close-ups of the stitching. It just really is beautiful. I usually take these photographs and discover that I've left a thread on there, and I do believe that I've actually managed to get rid of all of my little loose threads here, so I'm quite impressed with myself. And here, the triple stitching on top of the feather, so we've kind of got a feather design with the feather shape. And here you can also see pretty much any time I do a satin stitch, I've got a triple stitch along the outside edge of the satin and also along the inside edge of the satin stitch. And I think that just gives you this gorgeous, classy finish that you really can't beat. So it's going to look beautiful. So having finished the whole of the design, I'm going to remove all of the stabilizer from around the outside of the applique shapes. So all of the stabilizer that was in the hoop, and as long as I'm 100% sure I've finished stitching all hoopings, all of the stabilizer that was basted onto the background fabric. Now only remove it from around the outside of the applique shapes. Don't remove the stabilizer from underneath the applique shapes. If you keep that stabilizer in, first of all, it can be really hard to get it out, but if you leave it in, when you come to do your quilting, if you stitch in the ditch right around the edge of your applique shapes, that keeping the stabilizer in is going to give you a trapunto-like effect, which is going to give your applique shapes, basically, you're going to look like they've been trapuntoed. So leaving the stabilizer in is going to accentuate that effect for you. It's going to look gorgeous. So here I've got all of the stabilizer that was in the hoop removed, and then that clip didn't do anything. Here we go. Now I've got all of the stabilizer completely removed from around the outside of the applique shape. My Bernina tweezers are my trusted friend here. It makes it really easy to get in between the shapes. Some of them are fairly close together, so get your tweezers out and remove it a layer at a time. Should tear away really nicely for you. Now, just in case you're going to do this in more than the 2 hoopings. I got a little demo here for how that's going to work. So if you're using split 2 of the designs, then you're going to need to do 3 hoopings. So this is how you're going to mark your stabilize. Now notice, if you're paying attention before or when you watch the replay, when you're drawing the markings onto your stabilizer, A was at the top, B was on the right-hand side, B was on the left-hand side of the hoop. I've actually marked these wrong now that I look at it. A was at the top, B on the left, C at the bottom, D on the right. And what you're seeing now is I've still got A at the top, but I've got B on the right-hand side. So basically this, now I'm looking at it from the right side of the background fabric. C should be at the bottom, D should be on the left. Sorry about that. So the first hooping is, and I believe this is called split 2, block B split 2A. That is going to have, you're going to be using the intersection labeled number 1 as your center point, and you're going to stitch out the 2 hearts, the little one at the top, the bigger one at the bottom. Number 2, or block B split 2B, so the second part of the design, you're going to stitch out on the left-hand side of your background fabric. And before you do, you're going to remove the basting line that holds the background fabric into place around the hearts. You want to get rid of that before you do the second hooping here. And then your third hooping is going to give you the right-hand side of the design. And again, I removed the basting line from the second hooping before I stitched out the third hooping. Not essential here because nothing's going to overlap. If you are going to use the split 3 designs, this is 4 hoopings, I think. You're going to have the slightly different markings. So you've got your vertical, horizontal centers, and A is at the top. Looking at it from the right-hand side of the fabric, B is going to be on the right-hand side. C will be at the bottom, D will be on the left-hand side. Now for hooping number 1, and this would be if you were using a large oval hoop or something equivalent, the instructions will tell you that you want to stitch the design so that it's centered over intersection number 3, and the top of the hoop marked A is going to be to the left-hand side of the hoop. So you can see here, that's how your background fabric is going to be oriented. So the top of the block is going to be hanging off the left-hand side of your embroidery hoop, and the design is going to stitch so that it's aligned with the intersection marked 3 on your background fabric. Now, when you come to do the second hooping, we've got the background fabric aligned top to bottom again. So A is now at the top, and you're aligning this second hooping with the center of the block. So the intersection of the blue vertical center line and the pink horizontal center line. That intersection is going to be for the positioning of this second hooping. When you come to do the third hooping, you're going to align the third hooping with the intersection mark number 1. Now, I remember seeing on Facebook, somebody thought that I had the numbers down wrong. What you see in the instructions for your marking are when you're looking at the stabilizer, when you're drawing on the stabilizer and you're looking at the back of the block. What I have here is I'm looking at it from the top of the block, from the right-hand side of the fabric. So hooping number 3 is going to stitch with the intersection marked at number 1, and the design here is how it will show up stitching in the hoop. And you'll see that the fabric is rotated to the right. It's actually rotated by 20 degrees. That's me being precise, and you don't really need to know, but the background fabric is going to be slightly rotated to the right, and you're going to stitch the design at intersection number 1. When you do the last or the fourth hooping, you're going to stitch this at intersection mark number 5 on the right hand side there, and the top of the hoop is going to be rotated slightly to the left, and that's giving you 1, 2, 3, 4 hoopings. What you stitch out should be exactly the same as what I stitched out in 2 hoopings, and which would be exactly the same as somebody with an E16 would stitch out in the 1 hooping. All of your pieces should fit perfectly together. These are my finished blocks. I love the way they look. I can't wait to start quilting them. I've got a whole bunch more work to do before I get to that point though. If you've enjoyed the webinar, there will of course be a replay available until midnight on Friday. So watch it as many times as you need. If you watch the webinar directly in YouTube on the replay, then in YouTube you can do the stopping and starting. You can also use the slider along the bottom so that you can jump over bits that you don't want to see, or you can rewind a little bit to repeat something. You'll also be able to order a DVD of the webinar. Go to sarahvedlerdesigns.com/webinars. Or if you go to sarahvedlerdesigns.com and hit on the webinars button in the top menu there, you'll be able to order the DVD. I'm going to say please allow 3 weeks for delivery of the DVD. It took a whole lot longer than I was expecting it to last time to get the DVD mastered and ready to ship. So I'm going to say please allow 3 weeks here. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to get it to you much faster. I am seeing just a couple of questions here. Some special tape for, and I think that came out, the question about the tape, when I'm using the tape to hold the background fabric onto the stabilizer and the hoop. Scotch Magic tape works perfectly. I suspect it's probably a whole lot less expensive than any specialty tape that you're going to find in a quilt shop. Don't tell your quilt shop owners I said that, but the Scotch Magic tape is going to do just a great job for you. It's pretty inexpensive and really easy to get hold of. Not seeing, is all this covered in the zip file? Yes, all of the instructions are in the download for block B, and also they will be for all of the other blocks. Block C is going to be available on March 25th and the magazine for the January, February, March, April, May, June edition is also going to be available, I think, on March 25th. So I hope you enjoyed. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with for your block B. Make sure that you're in the Facebook group. Make sure that you continue posting your in progress pictures. I'm just loving to see them. I love to see all the different colorways that you're coming up with. And now it's time to go home and do some more stitching. Talk to you later.